In case you missed it, and no judgment if you have, aliens have made it into the mainstream. Between the 2021 Pentagon disclosure and the 2023 whistleblower report the Inspector General called urgent and credible, there is little room for dismissal. So, who are they? Where do they come from? My next guest is a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech University. Part of his research draws on anthropology, astronomy, physics, and astrobiology to investigate UFO phenomenon, specifically the premise that aliens may be our human descendants returning from the future to visit and study their own hominin evolutionary past. Today, he's going to help us explore hominin evolutionary anatomy and variation as we ask the question, are aliens future us? Biological anthropologist, interdisciplinary researcher, scientific thought leader, Dr. Michael Masters. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Meredith.
This subject is so interesting, but I think people in the mainstream might be surprised to hear that somebody at the university level is researching it. Why is this subject matter important to you personally?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's true. There has been stigma that's pervaded this subject for a very long time. In fact, scientists were a part of what helped shape that and sort of force the stigma into the public mindscape. But that is changing. I think people are starting to recognize that it is a real phenomenon. And who better to study it and try to understand what's happening, what these craft are, who's inside, than people with various academic backgrounds and with expertise in various subject areas. So I am happy to see more people starting to take this seriously. And as that continues, I think we'll have more people in research, academia, the private sector, scientists in general, starting to really explore it in more detail and try to crack the case, so to speak.
And for you personally?
Well, for me personally, I've had a very long-standing interest in this ever since I first heard about a UFO encounter my father had before I was born. And yeah, it just really sparked my interest. It was something that was mysterious, and I've always been sort of easily bored by the banality of reality. So this was something that was anything but banal. And it kept my interest. Obviously, because of that stigma, I had to take some time and work through the system and go from assistant, associate to full professor, make sure the protections of tenure were in place before I really felt comfortable talking about it. But again, that's changing, and you see more people sort of dipping their toes in the water. And um, I have no regrets. It's been a really fascinating subject matter for me personally, and continues to be, especially with everything happening in the news right now, like you mentioned at the beginning of the show. So it's just getting weirder, and it's just getting more fun, really.
Yes, truer words could not be spoken. I think a lot of people, even with that, even if they, accept the headlines that we're seeing, may have a hard time entertaining the thoughts of origin for non-human intelligence. Why do you think it's important that we think about this as a society?
Well, humans do have a tendency to try to remain comfortable with what they know, what's familiar. And obviously, this subject challenges a lot of worldviews. It could potentially challenge people's notions of religious history and politics and just what we think we know about technology, and the way that we interact with it, the way we interact with technology in our everyday lives, and especially if we are talking about a much more sophisticated technology that potentially comes from our future. Once we begin to recognize what that is and what it can do, I think it can only propel us forward at a very fast rate, which then again challenges people's notions of normality and what is real. I mean, really, this subject is at the base level of that. What is real? What is our place in the universe? What is our place in time? So yeah, I think it needs to challenge people's worldviews. It needs to challenge people in general. I don't think with something like this we can just sit back and say, well, that's not real, because I don't want it to be real. I don't want to have to think about that and what it might mean for me and my own worldview and belief system, because this isn't just about these lights in the sky. This is about really an overhaul of our whole conceptualization of what is real and what our existence is. I think there's highly integrated aspects of consciousness involved. Like I mentioned, just the aspects of our religious history, the way we interact with each other on a global level, politically, economically. So, yeah, we're talking about a huge upheaval, and people aren't comfortable with that. But the more you sort of start small and just learn a little bit more and find reliable sources, then I think really it'll be the same thing for everyone else that it has been for me. It's just a really interesting rabbit hole with a lot of ups and downs. It's a roller coaster ride of reality, I guess you could say.
And identity. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
You're totally right about, it's at the center of who we are and where we are. And those are majorly fundamental aspects of our day-to-day living. And, you talk about rabbit holes, that's basically the chronic state of my mind. And so the rabbit hole that I go down when I think about the ideas of identity and location and origin, I think about, oh my gosh, some parents are still having a hard time explaining, sexual orientation to their kids. And now there's the idea of the gender identity aspect of it too, which parents are having a hard time with, a lot of them. And now can you imagine parents trying to explain as they yet don't even understand themselves? Okay, so little Johnny, where we come from may be totally wrong, and where we're going may look very different. And those little gray men that are on your backpack, that could actually be us. I mean, it's a really interesting concept that makes me glad I don't have kids.
Well, as someone who does, I mean, I've been doing this and talking about this a lot, really throughout my life. It started when I was about 8 or 9 years old that I got interested in the subject, and really, I mean, kids are pretty open-minded, and in fact, I'd argue more open-minded than adults. And obviously, if you're talking about quantum mechanics or the many worlds interpretation, block time or whatever, there's some difficult elements of the concepts related to this. But really, if you think about it, just saying that we have a history, we have an evolutionary past, we're here now, we're likely to have an evolutionary future. There's people there. There's people on this planet in that future, the same way that there were people in the same space in the past. We don't see them because they exist in the past, but there will be people in the future. And if they have the ability to travel through time, we would expect to see them. I think it obviously challenges worldviews, especially when it comes to causality and perceived paradoxes related to time travel that really aren't an issue in the way people conceptualize them. But I don't know. I think kids, my kids at least, it's purely anecdote to talk about them, and they've been around it more than most, obviously. But yeah, they soaked it up. It made sense. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, we know we're here. We know we had this evolutionary past. We're likely to exist in the future. Our technology is going to be more advanced than it is now. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of people just innately assume that there's these craft coming from the sky. They must be from the stars, that they're extraterrestrial. And there's a lot of problems with that I lay out in my first book, and to some extent the second. So, if we kind of start looking at other explanations, this one just kind of makes sense. And a lot of people are coming around to that they could just simply be our evolutionary descendants.
When you talk about how people have conceptualized aliens as from another galaxy and how that could possibly, not be correct, that was a new thought for me. Because when I think about time travel as it relates to non-human intelligence, or I guess I can't even call them that. Okay, hold on. I got to ask this other.
It's the new buzzword. It's the new buzzword.
I got to
we
ask.
got past extraterrestrial finally, but now it's non-human,
I know.
but they might be human. Another fellow exploring this, Darren King, Exo Academian is his sort of handle, I guess, but he started calling them neo-humans or some version of that. But yeah, I think we shouldn't just throw labels around. I try to use more ambiguous ones like visitors, travelers, things like that. But the lexicon's important, and it's good that you sort of recognize that and cross-checked, because I think we all need to with whatever term we choose. I'm guilty of that as well.
Well, it was such a foreign concept before, something that seemed very sci-fi and fiction. And so calling them aliens, it just fit because that's not real anyway, right? I mean, for me, I can only speak for me. But as I was researching for our conversation, I was like, wait a minute. If they've been here for a really long time, millennia, let's say longer, who knows? Then wait a minute, that's not even accurate to call them aliens. They're really more like neighbors because they belong here just like us, right?
That's a good way of thinking of it, sort of temporal neighbors. Um, yeah, interdimensional, perhaps. Definitely intertemporal, I would argue. And yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you do have the ability to travel backward in time, we're talking about people in our past who have a more limited understanding of things like material science and physics and astrobiology, astronomy. So we could have the same people in the same ships who are perceived and interpreted in highly different ways simply because of the technological level of sophistication that people in the past have. Um, and yeah, an analogy I like to make is if I got into one of these time travel discs, these UFOs, these flying saucers, whatever you want to call them, and I went back in time, I would look more or less the same as people 100 years ago. If I go back 2,000 years, I look a little bit different, especially if I'm going to a part of the world where my skin tone, my hair looks different. Go back 20,000 years, 50,000 years, and now we're the ones with the big heads, the big eyes, the small faces, all of these characteristics that are so commonly described in these instances of UFO encounters. So, if we can think about that same thing just projected into the future with more characteristics of our hominin clade, more derived characteristics, as we call them. And yeah, the more sophisticated technology that we don't fully understand because it seemingly defies the laws of physics, we just don't comprehend what those are yet. But if we get to that point and we start using them, we'd expect to see exactly what we see, blipping in and out of our temporal reference frame. That's a very commonly described characteristic of these craft. They just sort of appear and disappear, which is something we would expect of a time travel device. So there's a lot of ways of conceptualizing this, but even just starting from our own present and projecting that backwards, we can understand potentially what's going on with what is likely to be our future descendants.
So back to the question I kind of stumbled over earlier about, where they come from, right? Is the aliens or future us theory proposing that they're coming from the future back to our timeline and their future is also Earth?
Well, I have no way of knowing that, but it's a good question. I would assume, that Earth survives. We're obviously not making the best decisions with regard to the way we treat the planet, and you sort of have this tragedy of the common situation, just because we're all sharing the same Earth now. We're not localized populations. We're a very integrated global economic system, and on the island of Earth, you obviously have shared uh, resources and overuse of those resources. But I would assume, and it's purely speculation, that yeah, we're talking about people on the same planet simply coming back to visit various periods throughout the past. However, it's possible that we do become interstellar, that these ships obviously go very, very fast. There's no doubt about that. So it's possible that we colonize other planets and maybe after a given period of time return to Earth in the past to visit from those planets. Possibly we colonize the moon or Mars. But regardless of where we live, I do think there's a lot of indications that it is us. But I certainly can't say where they're coming from specifically in that future, if they are in fact future humans.
And you have said in some other interviews that not all of the neo-humans, I love that. I really enjoy Darren King. I was on Calling All Beings podcast where that's how we met,
Right.
and just really enjoyed his thoughts around all of this. So I think I might adapt that for our conversation, neo-humans. So
Yeah, I've started using it as well. I think it's a great term.
Me too. It's broad enough that it should last more than 2 weeks. We can't say that of all the other acronyms that have cooked up.
That's true.
So I've lost my train of thought. In some other interviews that you've done, you've talked about how the neo-humans aren't all grays and they aren't all mantids and they aren't all, all of these other forms that we see pop up, that some of them look exactly like us. And in your second book, which documents, I think, 15 well-researched alien abduction cases, I was curious, were there any of those cases in your book or that you've otherwise come across where the neo-humans looked just like us at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that was sort of a mistake I made, or at least I didn't have access to the same information when I wrote my first book, because I was really looking at this in the context of long-term evolutionary trends and how those trends, if continued into the future, are likely to result in this archetypal gray alien, sort of the cliche, stereotypical alien form with the big round head, the big eyes, the small face, lack of hair, very frail body, but still in possession of all of the same homologous characteristics that we have and that we share with other animals on this planet. For instance, tetrapods go back about 400 million years into the past, where you have 4 limbs. Within that, pentadactyly having 5 digits on each limb, and they're ubiquitously described with those same traits. Having, really just all of the same traits. I've said 100 times that if people are describing a spider type creature, some like squid spaghetti monster type thing coming out of these craft, I never would have been interested in this in any capacity whatsoever. But the fact that they look so human definitely piqued my interest and was a big part of my course of study. But if we do sort of break down what people see, and one of the problems and one of the reasons that scientists are sort of stumbling around right now is that we can't necessarily apply the same standards of evidence to this question that we can in other areas of study. It doesn't lend itself to experimentation, but we do have a number of other resources at our disposal, ones that we've been using in anthropology, sociology, psychology for a very long time. One of those is survey data. One of the largest surveys was conducted, I think it was published right around the time of my first book in 2019, was carried out by the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation. And they surveyed now upwards of 5,000 experiencers, contactees, abductees all over the world. It was in multiple different languages. So it's a very broad representation of what people experience. And through that, I learned and integrated this into my second book that the most commonly described beings, to answer your question, are actually human that look exactly like us. So it's sort of a stereotype that got applied, this gray alien. And those are commonly seen too. I think what they found, the results of their study, was that the most commonly seen were humans, just like us, and then small grays, tall grays, and then hybrids. And importantly, by definition, all 4 of those would be classified as hominin, upright walking humans, just like us. And then only about 5% were something that was a non-human form entirely. These sort of reptilian, mantid-like, even sort of ephemeral spirit sorts of things that people observe. So, this was a pretty good study. There's obviously problems with surveys, but the fact that they did it so methodically and have a really good sample size that's representative of the entire human population, I do think we can learn something from that. And it kind of makes sense why we would have humans more often than these other ones. In the same way, I make this analogy with geographic space. In the same way that you see people more often who live in your town or in your state than you do people in Zimbabwe or China or wherever, because they're farther away in space. The farther away people are in time, we'd expect to see them less often. So that might explain why we see humans that look more like us more commonly, because we have more of a approximate temporal relationship with them, if we can sort of make that analogy with space. Whereas people that are farther from our future would look more different from us, and we would be one tiny blip on their entire timeline, as opposed to one that they cross over more often if we're closer to them in time. So I think that could help explain in part the results of that study as well.
Can you just imagine if you were an experiencer, you're outside your Montana home, a craft lands in your backyard, and out steps some guy who looks like he's from Duck Dynasty, and he's like, "Hey, y'all," and you're like, "That's such a bummer." I wanted to see a gray.
Well, I'm not aware of any cases like that yet, but it's certainly possible. And what's cool too is you could have it once there's a time machine. Once we have the ability to traverse time, you could have people from the future going back, picking up people from the past and bringing them to the future. Um, I think it helps explain the sort of timeless aspect to it too, where you could have people through these hybridization programs, someone from the future hybridizing sperm and egg with an individual from the deeper part of the past, and they would look just like someone from a specific time, and they could live amongst us if they are human. And if the hybridization program that's so commonly described is real, then by definition, again, they would be human based on the biological classification of species concept. If two organisms can mate, reproduce, and produce viable offspring, then by definition, they are the same species. So I think that could help explain sort of the jinn, genie, people, with these seemingly magical abilities. Telepathy is one of them, clairvoyance, future knowledge. I think it could help explain those cases. And as many argue, if they've been living amongst us, that's potentially an explanation for how that's happened. And once you interject that aspect of time, it's easier to understand a lot of these other things that are described across these various reports.
The aspect of time is so large, though. I can see where a lot of people might get stuck there, right? Because
They do. Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems in understanding this from my experience.
right, because time travel. I think sci-fi movies have helped us think outside the box. However, they have also encapsulated these ideas in the realm of sci-fi for so many people that it can be quite upsetting to think of them as actual.
Yeah, and some have done more harm than good too. Like Back to the Future, for instance. It's not how time travel works. You don't go to the past and then screw something up so your parents don't get together and then you start disappearing from photographs and things like that. There's self-consistency in visiting the past. I would people interested in the subject, I would highly recommend a book called The River of Time by Igor Novikov, who championed and got very broad acceptance of his principle of self-consistency, where you're going to the past, you're interacting with that past, but you're not changing anything. And that's an important aspect of understanding the block universe or block time, also known as landscape time, where anything you do in that past, you will have already done before you even go to do it, because it's a part of that past. You're just going back in time to do the same things that you had always done. And when you get back to the future, nothing's different because you simply did that thing that had already existed as part of that past. So you can have all of these very intricate relationships within the block universe where you're not making any paradoxical situations, you're not changing any timelines, you're just a part of it. You have this inherent self-consistency in the block universe. And so yeah, a lot of ways in which time travel has been portrayed, it's easier to write a screenplay with the ability to change the past. It's very difficult to write a book or a story or screenplay which adheres to that inherent self-consistency principle. It's not as interesting, some could argue, either, because you want that change for your storyline. It adds another element to it. There have been examples where it was done well. There's a great show, I think it was a German show called Dark, that was on Netflix. I think there were 2 or 3 seasons of it, but the first 2 seasons especially, they really do a great job. Clearly they had some physicists or philosophers that were consulting for this show, because it's very well done, and certainly adheres to the block universe model and is still entertaining. My last book, the 3rd book I wrote, also, the whole, I guess I can't say that because it's a bit of a spoiler, but it sort of centers on this issue of change versus no change, the many worlds interpretation, changing timelines versus the block universe model, and comes out on the side of one of those. I won't say which, but yeah, it's hard. It's hard to write stories about time travel in general, But when you have the freedom to make it however you want, and you're not concerned about presenting something accurate, then it can kind of screw up the minds of people who are watching that, thinking it might be real.
Well, it's hard to probably write entertaining scripts when the characters presumably don't have free will because their actions are predetermined by their personhood. So
That's a good point too.
story over, so.
Oh, kind of. I mean, we all feel like we have free will. I started calling it feel will instead of free will because I mean, once you recognize that we don't, it doesn't really change anything. We still feel like we're making decisions. We still go about our lives the exact same way. We still talk about the future as if we have a choice. What do you want for dinner tonight? Well, I'd like this. What do you think we'll have? None of it matters. It doesn't change anything. It's just, doing the things that you were always going to do. And I don't know, for some reason that bothers people. It's never bothered me at all. I think it's actually kind of cool. It's like just, kind of riding along in the passenger seat of life and watching things go by. Beautiful scenery and whatnot.
So where did the concept that aliens are future us originate from?
I don't know if you can really find a point where it first appeared. I assume people have been thinking about this for a long time because it seems to be the most parsimonious explanation. It's the simplest, most intuitive one. In my second book, I did try to identify all the people I could who have presented this in some way, whether it be a paper or a book or a film. And the idea has been around for a while. There's even songs. There's a song by I forget the name of the band, one of the guys from Genesis, but it's called Aliens or Future Humans or something that spells out the exact theory in the title of the song. And it's the whole song is about that. So there's definitely been people arguing for this for a long time. There's even been physicists that were involved with the alleged crash at Roswell who said, that this is a time machine. So you can find instances like that going back to the 40s. But really, the idea has been around for a while. My role is just kind of to integrate it with various fields of science. So I took a multidisciplinary approach, looking at why, through astronomy and astrobiology, the extraterrestrial hypothesis has some problems and why that might not be the best explanation for this. It still could be an aspect of it. The extraterrestrial and extraterrestrial models are definitely not mutually exclusive, but there are some problems. And then, in physics and philosophy, looking at time, how backward time travel might work, especially with regard to what we were talking about earlier with self-consistency in the block universe. And then obviously the anthropology side, the human evolution side, because the most dominant trends throughout human evolution are encephalization. We have about a threefold increase in the size of our brains. The parietal lobes expand mediolaterally, which is something that's described in these instances of close encounters too, that they have these big round heads. And that's actually a trait that defines anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens, as we're characterized by something called neurocranial globularity, which is just a big round head. We also have a chin, which you don't see in hominin ancestors. And that's simply because our faces, our mid and lower facial anatomy have retracted and gotten smaller. They've been reduced and retracted to the extent that we have a mental eminence. The bottom of our jawbone, our mandible projects outward. So if these same trends continue, and there's no reason they wouldn't, I'm not speculating about what might happen between now and then, about where we might live, if we live underground or in space or anything like that. It's simply based on the continuation of the same 6 to 8 million year trends that we see in the past projected into the future, and how much those match up with the descriptions of these beings that are seen inside these ships, which under themselves seemingly have characteristics of a form characteristic of the function of backward time travel. I think the discs are the actual time machine themselves.
It's interesting to think of what we've always called UFOs as time machines instead. I've been thinking about that since, we kind of set up this conversation. You said 6 to 8 million years. Do you think it'll also take that long for us to get from where we are physically now to the point of being anatomically like the Greys?
No, because another characteristic of hominin evolution is a very steep acceleratory curve. We see an acceleration in the way these changes are taking place. And there's a number of factors involved in that. One more recently is that we've domesticated ourselves. We're characterized by self-domestication, really beginning about 30,000 years ago. And then that started accelerating even more after agriculture. We became sedentary. We had selection for more pro-social behaviors, collaborating with others, individual level and group level. And then that sort of set in motion other characteristics that we see with the domestication process. We see those same ones in humans. Just our culture in general, the acceleration of our culture also relates to physical changes, where we have something called biocultural evolution, which we don't see in other species, but our culture influences our biology influences our culture. One example, I was talking about the reduced and retracted face. One of the reasons that happened is we started cooking our food and we started to be able to process our food because of stone tools. And those are cultural inventions, fire, stone tools, but it affected our dental anatomy and our musculature for mastication, for chewing. And so, yeah, the faster our culture changes, we'd expect our physiology to change rapidly too. And another one related to that is CRISPR technology, genetic manipulation. It's possible that we'll do more of that in the future, and who knows how that'll impact our physiology. But if it's another cultural thing that could potentially uh, change vastly our physical characteristics.
When I think about anthropology, I always go the direction of communication. That's just connecting and communicating is just always something that's been of interest to me. When you think
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
our evolution and the idea of form following function and these neo-humans being they're operating on a different conscious level. What does that say about how we'll communicate with one another and the quality of that communication? Because I'm sure, as you know, you said you have kids, like the ability to communicate, the ability to connect in a genuine, meaningful way is, some would say, deteriorating.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think you're spot on that there is an evolution. There's obviously an evolution to the way we communicate and the complexity of our language. It's thought that the first proto languages arose about 1.8, 2 million years ago with early Homo erectus, simple grunts, sounds that we could interpret and understand because they were shared, they were conventional. And then over time, especially with the advent of our own species, Homo sapiens, about 200, 300,000 years ago, it started to increase in its complexity, more symbols, more representations of ideas and thoughts, and not just, horse or rhinoceros, but like the ability to communicate about things that might take place in the future, things that took place in the past, having that temporal perspective and words to describe those things. But then I think there's an indication that our consciousness evolves too, and it's very likely that we'll get to the point where we don't use words any longer. We can communicate directly with our brains. If our brains are just this antenna that's sort of sending and receiving these waves of energy. If that's what consciousness is, if it manifests in all living beings, there's one universal consciousness, and then we sort of develop out of that in all of these various forms. If we're able to tap into that root aspect of consciousness, that may help explain the telepathy that's so commonly described, where it's brain to brain interaction or consciousness to consciousness interaction outside of the brain through the mind. And that is something that we see in these cases where people interact with these, what I would argue are more evolved humans, the gray types of humans with the bigger heads, smaller faces. But you don't necessarily get that as in as many cases where people interact with other people in these time machines, in these UFOs who look just like us. So yeah, that sort of indicates to me that if they are future humans, that we start to get to the point where we do communicate in that way. And yeah, to answer your question, I don't know how that affects our ability to communicate, but I would think if you're able to communicate uh, packages of information at one time, like feelings and your own thoughts, that would seem to be much better than trying to find the right word or the right group of words to form a sentence that conveys an idea, especially if it's a more abstract idea. So I don't know. I guess I would be more optimistic and hopeful that in the future we will have new forms of communication, which would allow us to communicate in new, different, and potentially better ways.
Accurate communication also increases mutual empathy. And so from my hopefully, my hopeful utopian idea of what the future could be, that people wouldn't be as, as much assholes to each other, that they would be able to connect and communicate, convey perspective, instead of taking a walk in another person's shoes, you could just like mind meld them and go, oh my gosh, your dad beat you. That's why you're an asshole. Oh,
Yeah.
well, let's go get lunch. I don't know. That was an overly simplified version of that. But certainly the process through which communication happens is already changing in terms of technology and brain interfacing. And some of the theories about how the crafts time machines are propelled is that, that it has some sort of skin on it that has a interface with the neo-human's consciousness, that they control it with their thoughts a little bit, which sounds far out there when you word it like that, but brain computer interfacing is happening right now. So I can kind of see okay, we're kind of on that path.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things in there that I'd like to focus on. And yeah, one of the things I did in my first book, especially, was show how many technological advances and devices we have now, that are described in these instances of interaction with what is likely our future human selves. Like for instance, there's an ejaculation machine that's commonly used in Japan to get sperm samples from men. And that's one of the most commonly described experiences that people have, that males have, is that this device is placed on their phallus, and yeah, sperm is taken in almost every instance where a male is abducted. That's described. So we can see these technological correlates, these things that are seemingly connecting our present with what is likely to be our future. And yeah, if we can look at brain to brain interaction, brain to computer interaction, if we are starting to integrate our own bodies and minds with technology, then that could be an aspect of how these ships are controlled. In the Travis Walton case, he escaped the place where they were doing this medical intervention because he was zapped by an electrostatic discharge from the craft, and they brought him up to heal him. But he escaped, went into a control room where there were actually buttons and things in the control room because he was pushing them and the ship started moving. Then he was like, I probably shouldn't do that because I'm going to crash this thing. So it might be a temporal thing too, where in the future we do develop that relationship with technology more, that we can control things with our mind. But to your earlier comment, I certainly think that as our consciousness evolves, it does correlate with an evolution of empathy. And we can see that already looking at our past. It was only 60 plus years ago that we had Jim Crow laws, and slavery was only a couple hundred years ago. And 500 years ago with European colonialism, the atrocities that were perpetuated on people throughout the world in association with that, killing entire swaths of people, stealing their resources, stealing their land. So, um, we can already see sort of a general move in that direction. But I do get the sense too that the people in the future do have a deeper sense of empathy. And it's sort of an oxymoron. It's sort of a conflict because the things they're doing to us are arguably unethical.
You mean robot
And
rape?
well, a lot of things. Yeah. I mean, there are instances of interaction that could be classified as rape. Certainly, touching people in their no-no squares and taking sperm and egg and fetuses. That's obviously not something that we would consider to be ethical today or in the future. But at the same time, looking into the eyes of these potentially neo-humans, people do have a deep sense of love and empathy. And with further interactions, another thing that was found from the Dr. Edgar Mitchell study is that 85% of people who interacted with the humans, the human-like beings, had a positive experience or somewhat neutral. Only I think 5% had a very negative experience as described. And another interesting thing they found is that with continued contact, people not only had a more positive experience, but they longed for further interaction. And I think a big part of that is sort of the love and empathy that's felt in these relationships, just a higher consciousness in general, that tends to foster that. So yeah, I tend to be optimistic too in the future, for the future. And it seems like we're already moving in that direction. There's obviously, it's kind of the one step forward, two step back thing, because there's definitely a lot of hatred in the hearts of people today. But yeah, once you break that down and sort of look at their own upbringing and the nurture side of what they might have experienced with abuse or anything else, just lack of love, nurturing, then yeah, you can understand that on a personal level. But as we continue to move forward as a species, and if we do grow a deeper sense of empathy and love, I think that'll eventually pervade the entire species, and those individual instances of neglect and abuse might be less common.
Well, I hope so. But I do want to come back to the robot rape because in Circle K, which I promise those two are connected. So just hang with me.
I'm curious as to how that might be. Do go on.
So I talked with Tim McMillan a while back. It was back in 2021. And he was talking about, the ease at which beings would be here or not be here. Are they manned vehicles? Are they drones, et cetera? And that started a new path of thought for me about, the effort behind neo-humans visiting this timeline of Earth, because I accidentally had a merger of magic and neo-humans, right? And this happens a lot. I also talked with Diana Pasulka, and she talked about the intersection of technology, religion, and UFOs. And it's interesting to have these conversations with smart people like her and you, and then observe my own thoughts in a way that I realized later, oh my gosh, that lines up with what they said, because I had thought of aliens as like magical beings that can pop in and out whenever they want to, and never considering their motives or the difficulty upon which, they would have to take on these endeavors. So for the sake of the robot rape question that I have, let's say that coming to this timeline on Earth is not as easy as a trip to Circle K. That it's not like, oh, be right back, mama alien. I'm going to go check out these humans over here. Let's say it's great effort, great personal risk that they take in order to have these, what I assume are like anthropological, trips to our timeline.
Yeah, it seems like it.
It does. But what would be their potential motivation? And that's where the robot rape comes in, because I've heard you talk about fertility and maybe they have problems. Is that the reason, in your opinion, that they might be willing to risk great personal harm to themselves and to their very probably expensively awesome technology that they would need to come back and also risk being seen and all of that?
Yeah, I do. I do think that for them, the benefits must outweigh the costs, or they wouldn't be doing it. And yeah, there's some indications. Again, if we look at past trends with regard to fertility and fecundity, that we are sort of moving toward a place where we have issues with that, as a result of genetic homogenization throughout the world. We see a 60% reduction in male sperm counts over the last 40 years in the industrialized world, a little bit less so in other places, which has largely been tied to pollution and the way that affects gamete production. Increased frequency of in vitro fertilizations to help get around problems that females have, males have. So yeah, I think if those trends continue, we are likely to face a situation where we may have to return to the past to get gametes from those past people in order to help alleviate problems in the future. So people see us, being taken, sperm and egg extracted, developing fetuses extracted, and they think, oh, they're doing something to us. But I don't think that's the case. I think they're doing something for themselves. And yeah, the great personal and societal risks they take to come back in time and do these things, I think must be worth it for them. And may even, have something to do with the survival of our species into the future, especially if there is some sort of impending cataclysm, which tends to be what's coming out of certain circles, intelligence circles. Frank Milburn, Ross Coulthart have talked about this extensively. If anyone wants to follow up on that, then potentially we're looking at a very strict bottleneck in the human genome, in the human population, and the only place to sample wild type genes to help diversify a very truncated human population might exist in the past. So it's very likely that they're doing this for themselves, and that's why we see that aspect of fertility, gamete sampling, so commonly described. And there's other aspects to that too, but I do think that is an important part of it, and potentially why that's so commonly described in these interactions.
If I ever get the chance to interview a neo-human, I'll ask them this.
I mean, that's the hard part is why,
Yeah.
why is difficult in the archaeological record. We can see the material remains of past civilizations and what they made. We can't know why or what symbolism it had, what meaning it had for them. And the same thing applies here. We can see what they're doing, but the why question is difficult. I do think, like you said earlier, that there is sort of an anthropological research side to this, and acknowledging my own biases as an anthropologist who studies evolutionary change and cultural change. There seems to be a lot of correlates with what they do and what I would do as a modern anthropologist. If I had access to backward time travel technology, I'd be taking skin samples, hair samples, fecal samples for analyzing their diet. I think that can help explain the ubiquity of the anal probe aspect of this. And yeah, sperm and egg, taking gametes for whatever purpose that I don't believe is nefarious. I do think it's something that benefits them in some way.
You said ancient civilizations. I got to ask, ancient alien theory, thoughts?
Well, I obviously don't subscribe to the whole aliens built the pyramids thing, or, aliens doing anything that past people were certainly capable of doing. And in fact, it's kind of racist to say that these people couldn't have done that without help. And it's never European groups, it's never Stonehenge or anything like that. It's always these temples in Mexico or Middle East or somewhere else. So people of those times were certainly capable of doing those things. But with that said, if we do have people from the future traveling back through time, there's going to be a legacy there. There's going to be certain things that are innately observed and integrated within those societies. Religions could grow up out of seeing these beings with these amazing abilities. The intentional cranial modification that occurs throughout the world and in many civilizations going back tens of thousands of years, where seemingly they're shaping a child's skull to make it look more like these beings, that they would perceive as gods because of the technology that they have and the sophisticated way in which they communicate and interact. So, yeah, I think things like that should be taken seriously, but I certainly don't subscribe to the idea that aliens are coming from outer space or from time to do these things when people of the past were certainly capable of such feats.
Yeah, we tend to think of time as linear and upward always, and it's not that way. But yeah, especially as Western people, especially in the U.S., I'm afraid we have a pretty narrow lens through which we observe the world. We kind of observe it through a very like U.S. centric, Western centric lens. And so it does impact us. But the good news is there's plenty of people out there who are curious enough about their own thoughts to question them, which I applaud that. That's what the goal of this show is. Great. And who are, really seeking out a more complete version of our human history. And now we get to add to that a more potentially complete version of our human future, which is pretty exciting. Earlier, you mentioned Roswell. And in David Grush's interview, he talked about a being that was alive being captured from that crash, and that the US brought in a linguist to try to communicate with the being. I can only imagine you, not as a linguist, but you as an anthropologist. What do you imagine that would feel like if you got the call from the US government and they were like, Dr. Masters, we need you?
Yeah, and I think that would be amazing, to be able to interact with someone who originated in the future. There's obviously a lot of questions. People always ask me, if they came back and picked you up, where would you want to go, or when would you want to go? Expecting that I would say, like, visit my favorite hominin group from the past, but I would want to go see that future they came from. I think it would be far more interesting to see where we're going as a species, technologically, culturally, with regard to empathy and consciousness, like we were just talking about, to really get a sense of what the future of the species looks like. Because sometimes it's kind of depressing to live in this time, with all of the political turmoil and economic disparities and whatnot. So yeah, I think it would be cool to see that, because I do have hope for that future based on what these individuals are like and what they do and how they interact with us if they are from the future. So I think it would be cool to see that. Um, and yeah, if we had the ability to sit down and talk to one of them here in this time, I think there's a lot we could learn from that too, and probably have, because like David Grush said, we have retrieved craft, and as part of those crashes, there's people inside, there's bodies inside, there's visitors, beings. I forget what he said specifically. And yeah, we crash stuff all the time, and we don't die every time we crash, so it's likely that they survive some of those too. And yeah, maybe these interactions did take place. There's no publicly available proof of that currently, but I think it won't be long before we all recognize that that did happen, probably numerous times.
The aliens is our future us theory. How has it changed how you see yourself?
Um, well, I guess I see myself as a lot busier now than I used to be. When I was just doing research on, ocular issues, juvenile onset myopia, astigmatism, things like that. But, I was working hard, writing grants, writing papers, but certainly not to the extent that this subject has sort of taken me down another path. But I think it's sort of given me a much better understanding of humanity. I mean, that's the main thing we study in anthropology, is what it means to be human in all of these different capacities. We have these various subfields because humans are extremely complicated, complex animals. So we have culture, anthropology, archaeological, linguistics, biological. And I think this subject sort of forces you to see all of those in the context of this question much more holistically, because we're talking about, like you mentioned, language, the evolution of culture, the evolution of our physical form, and then other, I think this is going to have to be a multidisciplinary study. Sorry, they're picking up my trash right now.
It's okay. I can't hear
It's a
it.
very loud machine, but I'm glad they come, so I'm not going to knock it. Usually doesn't take very long. But then also psychology, economics, politics, religious studies, I think is going to be,
Mm-hmm.
and already is, a very important part of this. And especially moving forward, because a lot of religious people are going to have their worldview challenged. And there's going to be people that say, no, that's the devil's work. And there's going to be people that open their eyes and open their minds and realize that it's probably a much more complex situation than they're currently aware of. So all of those things have happened to me too. Like I said, my first book, I was really just focused on those four areas: astrobiology, astronomy, physics, and biological anthropology as a whole, I would say. But I've realized that there's much more going on. There's a spiritual side of this, a consciousness side of this. And yeah, it's taken me down a really long and winding rabbit hole that continues to inspire more questions than it provides answers. And I think, if we all sort of step back and look at it holistically through an anthropological lens and a multidisciplinary lens, I think we're all going to start to grow and understand not just the UFO phenomenon, but really the essence of humanity.
I hope so. That truly is my hope through this, because I think one of the advantages, at least this is what I tell myself, of not finishing college is that I have not been indoctrinated into a specific thought process and a specific way of behaving that is, approved by the institutions that are there. So I have a tendency to see hard and soft sciences as two things that should belong together and not be separate, and certainly not be arguing with each other. And so I hope that you're right, because when I was listening to all these interviews that you've done, I couldn't help but have philosophical thoughts. I couldn't help but try to attach meaning to the data. And I know from a scientific process point of view, that's definitely frowned upon. But I wonder what it will look like when philosophers, the Catholic Church, the, biologists, anthropologists, astrobiologists, when they all come together, it'll be interesting to see how we as humans in those positions overcome ego for the purpose of true advancement, instead of just, patting ourselves on the back within our respective tribes.
That's very well stated. And you're absolutely right. To revisit your previous question about how the study of this has changed me, I was raised as a strict materialist, reductionist, where we can only know what we have data and what we can study in experimental ways. And, I think I was one class away from a graduate minor in statistics. I love statistics, and I loved how you can, do this process of hypothesis testing but then, this subject doesn't lend itself to that. And so we have a lot of people in the academic community, especially in the hard sciences, who have always sort of thought of themselves as superior to start with, not realizing that there are a lot of things that we can learn and only learn through taking a soft sciences approach, and especially in anthropology, because we can't do experiments on humans. So we have to draw from other resources in order to be able to understand our own species, and that lends itself well to the study of the UFO phenomenon. It's broadened my perspective, the way I approach science. And I think, if we continue to beat that dead horse and live in this purely reductionist, materialistic world, they're part of the problem. They're not doing their jobs as scientists when they just say, well, this can't be real, so I'm not going to study it. I'm not even going to take the time, because my scientific background pervades my ability to even look at this as a serious subject. And you see that all the time. I won't name names, but there are a lot of very loud people out there who are missing the boat entirely, because they're stuck in that mindset, which is arguably an aspect of certain fields of study within the academic structure. I would recommend Jeffrey Kripal's books to anyone who wants to explore that a little bit more. He does a great job, especially in the flip, supernatural, really showing just the value of the humanities and the soft sciences, and how much we can really learn, not just about the UFO phenomenon, but near-death experiences, consciousness, all of these other aspects of our reality that are sort of seen as the paranormal, outside of the normal, but are very much a part of our reality. And, there's a lot of overlap with the UFO phenomenon. And he does a great job exploring those. What was the other one? Oh, yeah, Authors of the Impossible is another really good book. People want to check those out.
You've given us so much to think about. I've really enjoyed this chat, and I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate you, taking time to share this with my audience, because, they are curious, and it's really fun to talk with people who have that what before we've seen as a contrast of worlds, the academic and the paranormal, if you will. As we wrap, can you tell people where they can find your books and how they can connect with you at the MUFON conference?
Yeah, the books, getting attacked by bugs here all of a sudden. The books are available, obviously on Amazon and Abe Books or wherever people shop for books. But obviously, it's always better to go to your local bookstore and help support the brick and mortar businesses that are seeing a bit of a resurgence lately, which is great. And then I'll be presenting in Cincinnati, Ohio. Their sort of focus this year is very much in line with what you and I have been talking about in this conversation, where they're exploring the question of friend versus foe. What's the intent? What can we learn potentially about the intent of these visitors, based on their potential origins and what they're seen doing? So I'll be exploring some of those questions in a talk on Saturday, I think August 26th, whatever that Saturday is at the end of August, and then in a panel on Sunday the next day. I've also got a website, just michaelpmasters.com. There's a contact page there and links to the books and various other resources. So this has been a lot of fun. I've really appreciated your questions and insights offered as well. I think just the more we keep talking about this and looking at those nuanced aspects of it with regard to what lies beyond the craft, what lies beyond these fast moving objects, these lights in the sky. There's a lot of questions, and it's just going to bring more questions into the fray.
Absolutely. Well, questions answered with more questions is what we do here. So awesome. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith. This was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Hey, you're still here. Thanks for watching. If you love breaking free from the algorithm to explore curiosity, join me each week by hitting subscribe and the bell for new upload notifications.